All right, here we go. In the spring of 1748, nearly 1,000 armed men of Philadelphia paraded through the city's streets. Artillery companies were also being trained, equipped with cannon sent from Massachusetts and New York. The president and members of the Pennsylvania Council reviewed the troops. They had endorsed the association, and the proprietary colony had no royal governor to oppose it. The proprietor, Thomas Penn, however, viewed these developments with alarm. He described the association as, quote, a military commonwealth, and declared it was, quote, acting a part little less than treason. Of Franklin himself, Penn wrote, he's a dangerous man, and I should be very glad he inhabited any other country, as I believe him to be of a very uneasy spirit. However, as he is a sort of tribune of the people, he must be treated with regard. Isn't that interesting? How do you get to be a tribune of the people? By popular acclaim? Probably just because he was so witty and was able to convey so much through his writing and diplomacy. Nevertheless, the idea that the people had a tribune, and his name was Benjamin Franklin, is kind of cool because I like the idea of our revolution coming from the people and not being the connivance of one group of rich folks against another. Hey, Baker. Carlene and everybody, David, Sean, thanks for being with me. Route 3, Box 6 is here with a whole bunch of stop signs. Well, we fixed it. Do you have a go sign for me now? Merry Christmas, David. All right. The battle for Ohio begins. There was growing alarm in London as well over the string of assertive demonstrations that the colonies would fight for their own interests. From the seizure of Louisbourg to Franklin's founding of an independent army, British colonial policy had suffered a series of major defeats. British troops fared even worse in the war in Europe, where the French army swept them from the field. By 1748, Britain had no hopes of winning anything militarily in Europe, and yet its continuing state of war with France had provided Americans with ample justification for their own military efforts. The British crown, with nothing to gain in Europe and much to lose in America, was forced to turn to peace and prepare for a longer war. Even Thomas Penn reflected the political dilemma in commenting on Franklin's argument for the association. Quote, though very true in itself, that obedience to governors is no more due than protection to the people, yet it is not fit to be always in the heads of the wild, unthinking multitude. What a perceptive thing to say. Of course, this is, I think, is William Penn's brother, or Thomas Penn. And as we learned from earlier chapters, they're very conservative and do not want to rebel. But this idea that he admits that obedience to governors is no more due than protection to the people. You know, that reminds me of a saying, it was famous saying attributed to Barry Goldwater, which is that rebellion to tyranny is obedience to God. That's a controversial statement, and I'm not sure whether I endorse it or not, but it's the same thing that Thomas Penn has just said here in our book, that obedience to governors is no more due than protection to the people. So it's a two-way street. It's a deal. You protect us, we obey you. If you don't protect us, well, we can overthrow you. On April 30th, 1748, the British and Dutch signed preliminary articles of peace with France at Aix-la-Chapelle. The French demanded the return of Britain's only significant conquest of the entire war, the fortress at Louisbourg. George II is reported to have thrown a rhetorical bone to his subjects in Massachusetts by replying that it was not his to give, since it had been captured by the people of Boston. Yet, at the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, signed by the warring parties on October 18th, Britain exchanged Louisbourg for the French-held port of Madras, India. The agreement was tantamount to Britain's declaring war on her own colonies. The interests of the British East India Company were thus given official priority over the survival of America. New England's heroic enterprise had been sacrificed for the greater loot of Britain's charter venture in the opium trade. Beyond the outrage in America, there were voices even in England against the settlement. The contemporary historian and novelist Tobias Smollett wrote that, quote, British ministers gave up the important island of Cape Breton in exchange for a petty factory in the East Indies, unquote. Well, of course, a factory is a trading post, and that belongs to the British. And when you mention the word opium, then you have explained the whole thing, that you're going to make a lot more money from growing opium in India and selling it in China than you will taxing tea in the port of Boston. All right, David supplies the green lights. Hey, David. Guys, once again, I have to say, if you want to just start learning some history, just go to David Cranmer Underdown on Twitter and start reading, because he does some amazing work there. And I know I've talked to you, David, about it, and I understand what you're doing. You're doing this to record and reinforce your own understanding. And while you're doing that, you're giving us the opportunity to learn from your work. So we appreciate it very much. I do. I'm sure everyone else does. Contrarian Barbarian. That sounds good. And Green Fang XYZ. Interesting name. Yeah, green's a typical controversial color, if you want to get into that, but I can't go there now. I'm going to read. Mr. Green, of course, the name for one of those horrible Nazi experimenters on humans. So there it is. That's a huge conclusion to reach right there in the last part of this book, and that is that yeah, America was going to be successful, but only if Britain didn't screw it up for us, and they did by, as we've just read, by giving that fort of Louisbourg, which controlled the St. Lawrence Seaway, back to France. Of course, this is before the 7 Years' War, before the settlement of 1763. So it's all going to provoke more conflict, although done in the name, I suppose, of peace. The idea here is that it's the speculators, the Venetian party in London, that is causing this change in British policy against American colonies and in favor of the British East India Company's scheme of enriching themselves through enslaving the Chinese to opium. Word reached the colonies in July that Britain was fully restoring the military capabilities of French Canada. Since those were already being directed against America, further French incursions were fully expected, peace or no peace. One of the provisions of Aix-la-Chapelle was that definite boundaries be established between British and French possessions in North America. Britain's return of Louisbourg was sufficient grounds to suspect that George II had little interest in defending the vast territory between the Mississippi Valley and Lake Erie, claimed by Virginia and contested by France. For America's Republicans, settling and physically gaining possession of the Ohio country thus became a matter of greatest urgency. In Virginia, the Fairfaxes and Washingtons were already stepping up the pace of their activity. On March 11, 1748, Lord Fairfax dispatched 16-year-old George Washington to begin mapping potential settlements on the western frontier of his proprietary grant, accompanied by George Fairfax, a charter member of the Ohio Company. They were instructed to proceed beyond the Shenandoah to the Potomac's south branch, which flows through a beautiful Appalachian valley, joining the river about 20 miles east of present Cumberland, Maryland. On October the 20th, the Ohio Company met at Lawrence Washington's Mount Vernon home and resolved to recruit German Protestant settlers through a Philadelphia merchant, John Stedman, who had been organizing passage to America for German immigrants since the 1730s. The decision to encourage German settlement involved more than the need to rapidly populate the territory beyond the mountains. British repression of colonial iron-making had also left America without a sufficient supply of skilled labor for that vital industry. As Alexander Spotswood had done in 1714, so Lord Fairfax and the leaders of the Ohio Company now turned to the Germans for a solution. German ironworkers soon began a string of bloomeries and forges in the Shenandoah Valley, thus developing the expanded sources of domestic iron, which proved crucial even to the time of the American Revolution. Skilled German ironmakers and metal workers were already at work on another essential enterprise. In 1748, at the frontier town of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, German gunsmiths began producing the first actual rifles in America. They were spiral grooved as opposed to smoothbore and were deadly accurate at more than 250 yards, roughly triple the effective range of muskets. Known as the Pennsylvania rifle, it was the basis for the later design of the legendary Kentucky rifle. The Ohio Company met again on June 20th, 1749, still awaiting approval of its charter from London, where John Hanbury had been diligently selling the Board of Trade on the commercial advantages of expanding the Indian trade in the Ohio country. Trade with the Indians was of more tactical importance to the leaders of the Ohio Company than any consideration of profit. The Ohio Indians were generally hostile to the French, but sustaining any allegiance to the Americans would require meeting their needs in trade. The government in Williamsburg had done nothing to secure friendly relations, even though these Indians resided in Virginia's western territories. At its meeting, the company decided to force the issue. The members resolved, quote, that the Indians at the Ohio be invited to a treaty and an interpreter be provided at the expense of the government. The company also requested Major Lawrence Washington to proceed to London to procure a good gunsmith and arrange with Hanbury the necessary articles of Indian trade. During Lawrence Washington's mission to England, another intriguing development occurred. Robert Dinwiddie, who had been in London for some time, resigned his customs post and soon after sought appointment to the Virginia governorship when William Gooch announced later that year that he was leaving office. On recommendation of the Board of Trade, King George II had signed an order in March granting the petition of the Ohio Company. On July 12, 1749, Governor Gooch announced the decision at a meeting of the Virginia Council, authorizing the company to establish settlements on the proposed tract, both north and south of the River Allegheny, otherwise the Ohio. Governor Gooch had already demonstrated that he had little taste for fighting, especially when the crown had quite different plans in mind. Certainly, the events of 1749 might have hastened his decision to retire. The French were attempting to shut off all access to the Ohio country. In June, the military government of Canada dispatched Captain Céléron de Bienville with a small force of French regulars and provincials and a band of Iroquois and Abenaki Indians, equipped with lead plates asserting the dominion of Louis XV. They marked a line from Lake Erie down the Allegheny River to the forks of the Ohio and claimed all the land west to the Mississippi. The inscription on the plates declared that they represented, quote, a token of renewal of possession heretofore taken of the aforesaid river Ohio, and cited the authority of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Céléron's force continued down the Ohio to Logstown, ordering the American traders there to withdraw. Then they made a sweep up the valley and back up the Miami River to Detroit, warning the various Ohio tribes to have nothing to do with the English. Having received word of this new French and Indian menace, the Ohio Company again determined to force Britain's hand. At its meeting on September 25th, quote, at the Falls of Potomac in Fairfax County, the company directed its London agent John Hanbury to seek a change in its royal charter. The original requirement that the members establish a fort to protect the venture, quote, out of their private fortunes was impracticable. The issue was now, quote, of a public nature, and a fort there will guard the other colonies as well as this. On January 29, 1750, the company decided to establish its, quote, factory at Wills Creek, a branch of the Potomac near Cumberland, on land to be obtained from Lord Fairfax. The Ohio Company was now the spearhead for a variety of efforts, both public and private, to extend America beyond its ancient mountain barrier. Pardon me. Imperial looting versus nation building. The thrust for development within the American colonies had not escaped the attention of King George II. His Majesty's government had no objections to granting a charter to members of a trading company who might risk their lives to exchange British goods for Indian furs, but it was firmly opposed to any growth of America's domestic agriculture and manufacture, which might free the colonies from British economic subjugation. You know, isn't it, that's one of the things that's just so obvious to me, is that if you want to be free, you've got to you've got to have domestic agriculture and manufacture. And here we are, you know, in this country and in this state, in my county, in my locality, there is no way that if, you know, trade with other parts of America, or if even if the internet was shut down, how would we feed ourselves? And how can anybody call themselves free if they can't at least feed themselves and make enough stuff to have a decent life? Okay, that's my aside for now. But really, I mean, self-sufficiency is the answer to all of this foreign intrigue. Just take care of yourself and tell them to go to hell. Wish it was that simple, huh? Well, we're getting ready for a new year, and we can take some hope in the gradual return of spring and summer, just like Chauncey Gardner and Being There. I was watching a little bit of that over the weekend. I'm going to go back and watch the whole thing again because it's just so full of amazing references that I didn't catch the first time I saw it. And I think there's a lot in there that we haven't really studied. Being There, a movie with the great Peter Sellers. Wow, 12 inches of snow this morning, Robert. That's amazing. I haven't seen 12 inches of snow in a long time. Britain's own industry, such as it was based on grinding up its own population, including women and children, at miserable wages under monstrous working conditions. Even with such brutal cost-cutting measures, its manufacturing profits were heavily dependent on foisting its products on the colonies at high prices, thus exporting poverty to America. In turn, Americans were expected to survive as suppliers of raw materials under a growing burden of debt. In the southern colonies, the policy took the form of outright slave labor, which provided additional profit to the British slave trading interests. By 1750, Britain had more than begun to fear that America intended to break this cycle of imperial looting. The mother country issued new decrees revealing the ugly face of her policies. The issues of the American Revolution were already being drawn. That same year, by an act of Parliament, the colonies were officially prohibited from developing their own iron industry. Wow, that sounds like when America stopped selling oil to the Japanese, doesn't it? Say, yeah, you want to start a war? Well, cut off my resources. The colonies were officially prohibited from developing their own iron industry. No more furnaces, plating forges, or slitting and rolling mills were to be built. No more necessities of life, such as ironwares for household use, tools for farming and construction, or hardware for horses and wagons, were to be available except from Britain. A zero growth policy had been proclaimed for America. Wow. Now it seems like we've gotten to another one of those zero growth policies, doesn't it? The Iron Act of 1750 was followed by the Currency Act of 1751, which was specifically aimed at New England. Its history of issuing credit and currency for useful enterprises dating back to the Puritans' pine tree shilling was officially relegated to memories of the past. Now, the British Crown decreed that no paper bills or bills of credit of any kind or denomination whatsoever shall be created or issued under any pretense whatsoever. Any attempts to sustain or reissue notes already in circulation were, quote, hereby declared to be null and void and of no force or effect whatsoever. As a warning to colonial governors, quote, whether commissioned by His Majesty or elected by the people, the order declared that should one of them assent to any act of assembly against this decree, he shall be immediately dismissed from his government and forever after rendered incapable of any public office or place of trust. Since His Majesty's response to the American capture of Louisburg in 1745, any hopes in the colonies for their future under royal rule had steadily declined. The Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle buried much of what was remained, and the subsequent imperial decrees added to the toll. There were some who looked to the supposed future king, Frederick, Prince of Wales, the rebellious son of George II. He had been useful to Walpole's opposition and still retained his image as the people's prince, who might become a patriot king. Even after Walpole had been driven from office, there had been some serious attempts to educate Frederick to such an idea. The argument that America should defer responsibility for its own future, however, died with the Prince of Wales on March 20th, 1751. Officially, his death was due to complications from being struck in the side by a tennis ball the previous year. Believe that. On the very day that Frederick died, Robert Dinwiddie wrote from London to Lawrence Washington that the, quote, direction of the Ohio Company now fell upon him, so long as his failing health would permit. In America, there were expressions of mourning when word reached the colonies in late May, and in Boston, several eulogies to the prince were even published. They provide useful insights concerning the significance that Frederick's death held for America. One stressed the positive concern, quote, he expressed for us, especially for our heroic and successful enterprise at Cape Breton. Another sermon preached by John Winthrop's close friend, Jonathan Mayhew, paid tribute to Prince Frederick as a great encourager of husbandry, manufactures, and commerce, parentheses, the true sources of national wealth and felicity. Mayhew was also the leading champion at the time of the writings of John Milton. He took the occasion of Frederick's death to exhort the people of New England to act like Republican citizens, according to the dictates of reason and truth, instead of leaving their fate in the hands of the British monarchy. For his text, he chose Increase Mather's old rallying cry from the fight for the Massachusetts Charter, quote, it is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in princes. Mayhew reminded his audience that the Roman Emperor Nero was at first esteemed as a prince of justice. Quote, but what afterwards? A royal monster, an imperial butcher. The same is true of many others likewise, so that subjects can never have an absolute security, that even the best of kings will not alter their measures, and oppress and devour instead of defending them. They are all as liable to fall and turn away from their righteousness as other men. It is a great mistake to imagine that any state of earthly power and greatness can make a man independent, exalt him above the reach of temptation, or remove him beyond the possibility of doing the most cruel, unjust, and shameful things. Well, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, I think is the lesson there. His sermon also invoked reflection upon Massachusetts' former Republican defiance and upon the folly of believing that good rulers were beyond the reach of the forces of evil. First, he asked, what of the worst princes whose power had been employed for destruction? And do you imagine that our own nation has been wholly free from them formerly, and are the very name of Charles and James forgotten? Nor have there been wanting examples of whole nations brought to ruin by well-meaning but impolitic princes under the influences of wicked counsels. As for princes who do not offer protection to their people, they themselves may die before us. They wither away and fall with years, as others do, unless perhaps they find a premature death. A dagger, or a cannonball, or poison is as fatal to the prince as to the peasant. The lives of the great are in continual jeopardy, either from secret treachery, or open violence. Isn't that funny? That's pretty much what I said at the top of the show. If you want to be a good prince, you got to stay good, or else you might find a dagger, a cannonball, or some poison will bring you to your end. By the conclusion of Mayhew's address, his eulogy for Prince Frederick had become a poetic device for instructing the conscience of his listeners, as though asking them to think like Franklin's American prince without subjects. He refers, of course, to poor Richard, the American prince without subjects. He emphasized that Frederick's application to reading and study, especially in the last years of his life, was very great and perhaps something singular in a modern prince. He added that Frederick well understood the consequence and importance of the American colonies and was accordingly desirous of cherishing them and encouraging them. In the tradition of the Puritan Jeremiads, whereby the earlier ministers of Massachusetts had issued marching orders in religious metaphor, Mayhew pointed the way to a true American republic. The possibility of revolution was not overlooked. Quote, a person that so well understood how to govern himself amid the snares and temptations of a court, where it is not, God knows, always the fashion to be wise and virtuous, could not easily have failed to govern others with justice and wisdom. But he is gone, gone from an earthly kingdom liable to changes and revolutions, to possess another which hath more stable foundations, a kingdom that cannot be shaken. The actual foundations of a new nation were being laid in more rapidly than the British realized. In 1751, Benjamin Franklin drafted his Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, Peopling of Countries, etc. It was not published for 4 years, and then anonymously, but was circulated privately as a kind of primer on how to destroy the imperial rationale for such measures as the Iron Act. Franklin carefully constructed his argument in such a way as to create short circuits in the limits to growth maxims which Britain applied at home, while using the same paths to demonstrate that quite the opposite measures should be prescribed for the colonies. The trick was masterful to the defective minds of oligarchical policy makers. Franklin appeared to use their own axiomatic assumptions, making his proposals for the colonies more difficult to refute. He confounded more than a few enemies. Decades later, Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus were still uncertainly grappling with this treatise. In Britain, the long reign of Venetian party economic policies was taking a murderous toll. Between 1738 and 1758, the recorded number of deaths exceeded the number of births by almost 200,000, 486,000 to 296,000. Franklin began his treatise with a nod to the British generalizations on this empirical phenomenon, empirical with an E, in cities where all trades, occupations, offices are full. Many delay marrying till they can see how to bear the charges of a family. Hence, cities do not by natural generation supply themselves with inhabitants. The deaths are more than the births. In countries full settled, the case must be nearly the same, all lands being occupied and improved to the height. Those who cannot get land must labor for others that have it. Laborers are plenty, their wages will be low. By low wages, a family is supported with difficulty. This difficulty deters many from marriage. He proceeded, however, on the premise of American development to argue that the same axioms dictated different policies for the colonies. Land being thus plenty in America and is so cheap as that a laboring man that understands husbandry can in a short time save money enough to purchase a piece of new land sufficient for a plantation whereon he may subsist a family. Hence, marriages in America are more general and more generally early than in Europe. Thus, our people must be at least doubled every 20 years. By axioms of British policy, such unbridled growth in population would mean economic ruin. Franklin parried that conclusion by noting that so vast is the territory of North America that it will require many ages to settle it fully. Until then, he added, labor will never be so cheap here, for the worker, quote, goes among those new settlers and sets up for himself. Here, the duel turned as his adversary considered the benefits of America's facing a prolonged struggle with high costs of labor, while the colonies pushed westward. Franklin's next thrust was so swift and sharp that a slow-witted opponent would hardly notice the wound. Quote, the danger, therefore, of these colonies interfering with their mother country in trades that depend on labor, manufactures, etc., is too remote to require the attention of Great Britain. But in proportion to the increase of the colonies, a vast demand is growing for British manufactures, a glorious market wholly in the power of Britain, even beyond her power of supplying it. Therefore, Britain should not too much restrain manufactures in her colonies. A wise and good mother will not do it. To distress is to weaken, and weakening the children weakens the whole family. Following these beguiling and disarming strains, Franklin prepared to drive his point home. Anticipating an ideological counter in the name of supply and demand, he turned that imperial argument against itself. To reap the bounties of an expanding American market, Franklin argued Britain would have to accept technological development or risk being eclipsed by other nations. Quote, besides, if the manufactures of Britain, by reason of the American demands, should rise too high in price, foreigners who can sell cheaper will drive her merchants out of foreign markets. Foreign manufactures will thereby be encouraged and increased, and consequently foreign nations, perhaps her rivals in power, grow more populous and powerful, while in her own colonies, kept too low, are unable to assist her or add to her strength. 'Tis an ill-grounded opinion that by the labor of slaves, America may possibly vie in cheapness of manufactures with Britain. The labor of slaves can never be so cheap here as the labor of working men is in Britain. Isn't that an interesting point? You know, that's one of the things when you study the Irish immigrants, and one of the first things you run across is the claim that the Irish were treated worse than the slaves were because the slaves were worth money and the Irish were not worth anything. So if you see the old wells, if you ever see the old brick wells that are laid by brick from the bottom, the people that went down the bottom of the hole to lay the bricks were the Irish. In the more than pedagogical duel Franklin projected, these ironical flourishes left his antagonist at a fatal disadvantage. He offered quarter on the following terms, quote, the prince that acquires new territory, the legislator that makes effectual laws for promoting of trade, increasing employment, improving land by more or better tillage, providing more food by fisheries, securing property, etc., and the man that invents new trades, arts, or manufactures, or new improvements in husbandry may be properly called fathers of their nation, as they are the cause of the generation of multitudes by the encouragement they afford to marriage. We have been here but little more than 100 years, and yet the force of our privateers in the late war united was greater both in men and guns than that of the whole British Navy in Queen Elizabeth's time. How important an affair, then, to Britain is the present treaty for settling the bounds between her colonies and the French, and how careful should she be to secure room enough, since on the room depends so much the increase of her people. Franklin's observations clearly defined the position of America's Republicans had taken by 1751. Their only allegiance by consent was to the necessity of progress. They had no intention of suffering the fate His Majesty had already imposed on his subjects in Britain, and they were committed to defending their interests by force of arms, if need be. Most of all, they were determined to pursue the great project begun by the Puritan founders of Massachusetts. They would not, as John Winthrop had put it, quote, suffer a whole continent as fruitful and convenient for the use of man to lie waste without any improvement, unquote. The approaching conflict. The year 1751 marked a turning point in American colonial history. The surge of nation-building aspirations, which had begun during the 1740s, was being transformed into specific plans of action, which the British monarchy clearly intended to prohibit. Britain's dilemma was that it had no reasonable grounds for doing so, as Franklin and others were quick to point out. American mobilizations, beginning with the Louisbourg campaign, had also changed colonial self-perceptions, such that British attempts at political repression were more likely instead to promote the idea of independence. Even before the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, it was also no secret to Americans that Britain encouraged French and Indian attacks against any attempts to develop the frontier. Since Louisbourg, however, it was not so evident in London that the French threat would hold America in line. New colonial initiatives to secure the vast territory beyond the Appalachian Mountains developed rapidly after 1751. They proceeded from a clear strategic assessment and were designed to open the West with or without Britain. Under authority of the Ohio Company, plans were pushed forward to colonize the new lands. Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Lord Thomas Fairfax, and Robert Dinwiddie became leading coordinators of the drive, which was strengthened by Dinwiddie's assuming office as governor of Virginia in November 1751. Measures were pursued to secure the friendship of the Indians of the Ohio country, and forts began to be constructed to defend the territory against the French. Scouting expeditions proceeded far down the Ohio River and gathered intelligence on boating conditions all the way to its junction with the Mississippi. Politically, the road ahead led to inevitable confrontation with either France or Britain, or perhaps both. But the Americans' strategy was brilliant and contained a fateful trap for Britain from which there was no imperial escape. Were France to yield to American claims to the Ohio country, then only Britain could stand in the way of a great nation-building enterprise. For Britain to choose such a course, an extremely difficult one at best, would simply intensify America's movement toward independence. On the other hand, if the French attacked the new settlements, the Americans would fight. Were Britain to defend its colonial claims, it would thus endorse the opening of the West and would have to abandon its own policies of containment. Britain's only remaining option, refusing to fight in support of the colonies, would immediately destroy its political hold over them and lead, as surely, to their independence. The story of how this trap was set belongs to the second volume of this work. Once it was sprung, the political dynamic leading to the American Revolution was fully in motion. It was sprung on May 28, 1754, by Colonel George Washington of the Virginia militia, when his troops engaged a body of French soldiers at Jumonville Glen, east of the Allegheny River. That victorious skirmish marked the beginning of the French and Indian War. There were those in Britain who recognized the trap, and they spent the next 20 years trying to wriggle out of it to no avail. After the news reached London, Horace Walpole, the brother of old Bob Booty, wrote, quote, "The volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire," unquote. In America, Benjamin Franklin convened a colonial congress at Albany to begin work on a plan of union. In support of the project, Franklin published America's first political cartoon. Widely reprinted at the time, it later became a symbol of the American Revolution. The cartoon portrayed a serpent divided into segments representing the separate colonies over the motto, "Join or Die." And thus concludes H. Graham Lowry's book, How the Nation Was Won, America's Untold Story, Volume 1, 1630 to 1654. And sadly, to my knowledge, he never did publish a second volume. But we are so grateful for the work that he put into this one. I don't think anyone else has ever written this book or even in any way really tried to expose the various moving parts that were going on in the 18th century. And he just did a marvelous job. So, yeah, don't tread on me. That sounds like a good motto for me here at Macduff Lives. We have to retain our humanity and our freedom. And in terms of government, we have to remain citizens and never subjects. And that's why we have absolutely to the best constitution we could have, because it wasn't agreed upon until it was agreed that there would be a Bill of Individual Rights. And we can thank James Madison and others for that. But the point is, we are the beneficiaries of a very, very lucky chain of events. And no matter what the fears are right now, we know that we do have the foundation in our Constitution, and the moral foundation is supplied by the Declaration of Independence, the beginning of our republic, and by the scholarship of people that keep the history alive. And for that, I thank H. Graham Lowry and Executive Intelligence Review, that's the LaRouche Organization's publishing arm, for this book. I will be looking into the best way to proceed with the American story, and we'll take it up from there, about 1751 or so. The next time that we delve into this history, I think I'll be looking um, at Treason in America by Anton Chaikin to give you a hint. That's where we'll be going with this next. Another publication of EIR, and one of my favorite writers, Anton Chaikin. Okay, that's right. We were born for this time. Yep, I love that. Have a great afternoon. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the Patreons, and thanks for the folks that joined recently. I do very much appreciate it. Helps us with the expenses.